Okay, I'm working on a 12 by 14 inch wash sketch. I'm going to kind of put my marks in here. I'm breaking up my picture plane and I'm just going to sketch in my important features, what I want to have where. So I went out to Asilomar and really enjoyed the beautiful rock formations. I love going out to Asilomar and just really watching the way the ocean wears away at the rocks. So I have a favorite spot that where the water comes rushing into a series of tide pools, and it's flanked by that wonderful rock formations. So what I'm doing now is I took some photo reference and I'll be working from 3 different views of that area. So right now my goal is to just sketch in the big shapes, give a sense of what that composition is going to look like. My goal really is to bring that water, it's coming towards you, moving towards you, and then it's just flanked by different rock formations. So the start of any painting, it's good to start at the sketch stage and just sketch out your big shapes. And that's what I'm doing. Find out what your big shapes are and how those shapes are moving throughout the work. So that's what I'm working on right now, just getting in those big shapes. So this rock formation to the left or to the right here, lots of nice craggy shapes. Once again, referring back to your contour drawing to think about what is the outline of that rock formation. What are those angles? Deciding how you're going to break up the planes. That's the trick to working with rock formations is there's all kind of plane changes, and that's pretty important. And that's what I'm just sketching in. What are my shadow shapes going to look like? Where am I going to put the shadows in? What are the big shapes and where are those plane changes occurring? And that's what's really going to give this rock formation that great appeal. Nice crevice right here. Now, as I said, this is going to be just a wash. I'm going to be using some watercolor paints, really just primarily Payne's Gray will be the primary base color, and I may add some warm tones into that in some areas where I might want to add some warm tones. There's just a wall of rock here that it's just really pretty beautiful. And that's my goal, is to just really capture this rock, the ocean, and then the sand. Here again, just looking at angles. What are my angles doing here? What is the shape of the sand? What is the movement? This is here. With trees and rocks, it's easy to get lost. So put some markers in there, some significant markers of where you want to be, where you want to be going with that movement. This nice shape coming in, and then right behind that we have a rock formation coming out. Here another shadow heading back. So we're looking at angles and movement. The water comes, stops here. Some nice round boulders. Once again, I'm using 3 different photo reference, so you can keep and remove whatever you may not want in the composition. So that's sketching in, erasing what doesn't need to be there. Always remember you want to keep your composition moving, so I want to continue moving this off the picture plane. So I'll softly allow this rock formation to move out. It seems to curve in, go up and in, big rock coming down, and then out of the picture plane. So I've got the right side worked in there. Now I'm going to work on the left side. Really nice big rock shape coming here with a nice shadow shape under it. Once again, this shadow, this big rock and shadow shape will help to indicate the volume of this rock, these big boulders. So we have a nice big boulder here, and underneath that there's a smaller boulder that comparatively next to it looks like a small rock, and some wonderful seaweed in here, and another boulder, and this boulder wraps around, comes out and into the picture plane, right out at this point, and all these smaller rocks move right into where the water is, which is right in this area. Here again, just sketching in the big shapes, deciding what do I want to put where, roughly indicating shadow, and just moving in with rough sketch shadow to move the viewer's eye through the piece. Various rock formations before we run into this boulder on the right. Okay, we have this another nice big shape wrapping down and out the picture plane. Okay, so I went in and finished putting in some of my shadow areas with the sketch, and then I mixed up some Payne's Gray and a combination of burnt sienna and phthalo green. And now I'm going to go put in my mid-tone shadow shapes. I did sketch in some of the shadow shapes as I went in to refine the sketch. And now that everything is all sketched in and my wash media is mixed up, I'll just go in and just go over those shapes to refine and just to dictate, not really refine, just to dictate what are those shadow shapes in the rocks. Keeping in mind, I'm using a mid-tone mixture. I'm looking at photo reference and moving down into the rock area, just as we would sketching, just to put in the shadow areas, to help to define those shadow areas in our rocks. And then later we'll go in and put in the darker areas and the lighter areas. Keep in mind with the wash media, you want to keep it transparent. You don't want to keep rubbing over the same area, it's tempting to go in and correct. But with water media, it's always better to keep it loose. So once again, looking at photo reference and just trying to put in those shadow shapes. Making sure that I'm catching the edges of the shadow, picking up where I don't need any value. This is an interesting shape down here. It indicates the turn in the rock. We always want to make sure we capture those plane changes. So I'm going to go down and be really careful about these shape studies at the base of this large rock formation. You always want that rock to feel like it's solid and connected. So I have some interesting breaks in the rock down here. Keeping it all mid-tone, not going in with really dark shadows because I can always go in later to add my darks. This is 140-pound watercolor paper, so it absorbs the watercolor very nicely. You do want to probably use, if you're using wash media, you do want to use a 140-pound, and that's going to work better for you. Anything lower than that number, it will have a tendency to wrinkle and buckle. This is kind of nice what happens in here, the drip coming down. If it works for you, great. If those drips do not work for you, then you could just go in with your brush, dry your brush, and just pick up the drip. But sometimes some of those drips create nice texture, especially if you're working with nature. Now there's a really nice stepping stone effect with this sheet of rock. So I'm just going in to repeat that in the shadow area. It really does indicate a plane change on this rock formation. And that's what we're looking for. We're just looking at the rock formation, looking at where the shadows come in and hit. I could put a nice mid-tone shadow on the other side of this rock. And just simple organic shapes. And this comes up again and it's attached to another rock formation. And if you put something in that you don't want to have there, this mark here, I could just add water and wipe it up with my brush. Just add water and help to erase it. I don't need this indication here. I could just pick it up. So anywhere that you might have some of value you do not need, you could just lift it up with a dry brush. Once again, being conscientious of your shapes, looking at those shapes. I will go in later with some warm tones, but for now, just filling in with my mid-tone. I like to start with the mid-tone and move out from that. Move out to either be light or dark. So here we have a nice shape, goes up, and this rock splits, and there's a distinct shadow shape underneath this rock. So it's nice even if you find that you have to draw that shape in. What does that shape look like to make it convincing? Goes up sharply. So here again, even for the wash, you are using your drawing skills. You're drawing with a brush. Drawing is a very significant part of painting. It's the beginning step. A drawing will inform your painting. Good to fall off of the edge. A nice white boulder up here. But nice to allow those dark values to move off of the page. That way, you have a point of entry into the drawing and an exit. Of course, not going to get too dark. I'll stick with my midtones. It's a nice rock formation that comes down in here. Falls into the sand. I'm just going to fill this in with value right here. And as you get more versatile and work more and more with the paints, you'll find that your stroke will loosen up. Okay, so I will continue in this way, just going in with my Payne's Gray, focusing on those shadow shapes, really determining from my photo or from life, what does that shadow shape look like? How will I move it up into the rock formation? So now I'm going in with a lighter value in this rock formation in here. I do want to maintain that sense that there is some soft shadow areas in the rock that aren't really, really dark. We do want to maintain the value and integrity of the watercolor. So even though photographically these values may look really dark, we do want to give that sense that this is granite or this is a sheet of rock in which there's a lot of reflective light bouncing around. So I'm just showing how to add a lighter value. I've really watered down that Payne's Gray. And as I move my brush across this sheet of rock, it's with a much lighter value. Keep in mind, I put in the midtones, and now I'm just working on just subtle indications of a lighter value with a very little bit of sepia mixed in there to warm that value where the reflective light is hitting the rock. It won't be as cool, as dark as the shadow. But we have a sense that that is a sheet of rock. So we don't leave it white. We have to put in a very, very light tone. And that's what I'm doing here. Very much watered down. And you can always add water to it to soften something. So I'll add a little bit of water just to soften and lighten that sheet of rock. Okay, at this point I've gone in and put in a lot of midtones. The entire wash right now is predominantly light tones in the sky. I put in a wet on wet wash sky. I went in and put some light tones in these rocks and mostly mid-tones. Wanted to show you what I was doing with this foreground, I'm just indicating a little bit of more mid-tone, and then I'll go in with my shadow. So I'm putting wash on top of wash very delicately so as not to get muddy. Most of the paint is dry underneath, so it's not wet on wet. And all I'm trying to do is, this is tricky, you don't want to overwork your piece. I'm just bringing some warm tones into this foreground and connecting the rocks. I don't want the rock shapes to be too fragmented, so I am working to unite all of these rocks in the foreground, all this in here. So I'm unifying them with a neutral color, which is a mixture of burnt sienna and phthalo green, is giving me this warm sienna where I'm just with a mid-tone finding a way to, and this is an angled flat brush, I'm just trying to, with that mid-tone, unite all of those rocks with this very light warm tone, not dark. And then I'll go in and in my shadow area, and that will be the last step. Keep in mind, this is not a finished painting. This is a sketch, and the purpose of the sketch is to decide, you know, what is the design of your piece? What is the focal point? What do you want to take precedence? And is my concept working? I love this rock shape. I think I'll leave it, and I do like the movement of the water coming in to this tide pool area. So now I'm going to go in with my darker values to really try to pull out some of those more detailed shapes in the foreground. What my inspiration is, I'm looking at Rogue River by Percy Gray, from the book, The Legacy of Percy Gray. And, you know, he has so many beautiful different values going on in that piece. And just referring to that and trying to go in and capture some of the really beautiful shapes he has, beautiful rock shapes, and almost mimicking it. You know, he has this beautiful, there's this beautiful rock in the foreground. How do I indicate that that rock shape is going to bring that viewer in? So he has this beautiful way of just very carefully layering one value of watercolor over another value to create those shapes. So I'm looking at the rocks he has in Rogue River. I'm looking at the shadow patterns that he's allowed to fall upon his rocks, and keeping in mind those rocks in the foreground are the rocks that are the darkest. So I'm just going to go in and, based on studying how he worked with his watercolor wash, I'm going to go in and kind of do the same thing. Connect these important rock shapes just by looking at them with value. How is this shadow going from transparent and then to less transparent, to give that feeling that the rocks are tumbling towards us. This comes forward, catches this rock, and now we're almost drawing directional lines. Keeping it loose, of course, at this point. Loose and not overdone. That's the tricky part with watercolor, is what do you need and what do you not need. We're not filling anything in. We're just figuring out what is needed and what is not needed. What contrast do we want? There's a really nice contrast between this dark shadow shape and the white edge of this rock. and deciding how far do you go with that shadow shape. Keeping in mind you want to keep everything transparent. You don't want to get too opaque with watercolor, because that really is the beauty of watercolor, is that opaque shape. I'm looking at Percy Gray's piece, and when he does get that really sharp shadow line, that directional line, he does not let it get too, it's only a slight indication. It's definitely not a bold shape, bold solid shape. So I'm looking at this nice shadow in here along this rock, and just allowing that to create just a little more depth on this rock shape here. And this whole piece is just building up your light values and your mid-tone values, keeping in mind always that your contrast in the foreground will bring the eye to the foreground. Have a lot of nice details going on in the foreground here. So that's my goal, and then I'm allowing the light tones to send your eye to the background. A lot of interesting seaweed here in the foreground, so it's okay to bring in some dark texture. And being careful not to get too busy with that nice big rock formation. Again, referring to how Percy Gray handled the plane changes on his rocks. And that's how I'm looking at how he used value. It's always really great to refer to favorite artists just to see how they do things, and to try to pay attention to what technique they're using or what medium they're using and how they're using that medium. So that's what I'm just going into these shadows and just creating another value. So we've got the dark shadow values and really helping those rocks in the foreground. So that's where I'm going to focus my area of interest, is really bringing these rocks to the foreground. Once again, that will be with that darker value. A lot of wonderful seaweed, kelp forest type objects in the foreground here. Lots of nice texture, shadow, detail. All that will bring the viewer to the foreground. So once again, I'm sticking with the same colors. I've got my Payne's Gray, and then I mixed up a burnt sienna with a phthalo green, and that's what's giving me this warm seaweed kelp forest tone. So I will go in and do this. All this takes a lot of time, so I'm just demonstrating the technique. But take whatever time you need to bring the painting to what you want it to be, and move slowly. Really check your values. With watercolor, move slowly.